The Haunting of Hinterwald. Bavaria, 1922. The Hinterwald farmstead lay nestled in a thick forest, miles from the nearest village. For decades, the Dürer family had tended the land in solitude, their lives dictated by the rhythms of nature and the turning of seasons. But this winter had been cruel. The snow lay thick on the ground, and the isolation felt heavier than ever. It began with the noises. At first, they were distant, a faint scratching against the barn door, the muffled sound of movement in the attic. Klaus Dürer dismissed them as the wind or vermin seeking shelter from the cold. But as the nights dragged on, the disturbances grew more insidious. Footsteps echoed outside their bedroom window. Whispering voices drifted from the eaves, unintelligible yet urgent. Then came the footprints. One morning, Anneliese, Klaus's wife, discovered a trail leading from the forest's edge to their home. The prints were deep, suggesting a heavy figure, yet they stopped abruptly at the threshold, never entering, never leaving. They appeared again the next night, circling the barn in chaotic loops before vanishing into the trees. Fear settled over the family like frost. Their children, Lotte and Emil, spoke of shadowed figures in the corners of their room, of something breathing beneath the floorboards. Anneliese refused to be alone, clutching a rusted crucifix as she whispered prayers to a silent God. Even Klaus, a man of hard logic, found himself watching the darkness too closely, waiting for it to shift. Then, on the night of March 31st, everything culminated in blood. A storm raged outside, the wind howling like a wounded animal. Klaus lay awake, listening to the noises, scratching, footsteps, whispers, until a sudden silence settled over the house. A moment later, the lanterns flickered and extinguished all at once. A scream rang out. Klaus leapt from his bed, rushing toward the children's room. The door was ajar, swinging gently on its hinges. Inside, Lotte and Emil's beds were empty. Anneliese's sobs echoed from downstairs. He found her in the kitchen, kneeling on the floor, her nightgown soaked in crimson. The children's lifeless bodies lay sprawled at her feet, their throats slashed open as if by an animal's claws. The back door yawned open, the storm raging beyond it. Anneliese trembled, eyes wide and unseeing. "It was inside," she whispered. "It was inside all along." Klaus barely had time to process the horror before a cold hand clamped over his mouth. He was yanked backward, dragged into the darkness. His last sight was his wife's tear-streaked face, her scream lost in the wind. By morning, the Dürer farmstead stood empty. The neighbors who arrived later found the house undisturbed except for the bloodstains in the kitchen. The barn door stood ajar, swinging gently in the wind. Of Klaus and Anneliese there was no sign. Only a new set of footprints led from the house into the forest, deep, heavy impressions, stopping where the trees grew thickest. And there, among the roots, the earth had been turned as if something had crawled its way out. The murders of the Dürer family were never solved. The farmstead was abandoned, left to decay beneath the weight of superstition. But even now, the villagers say that on cold nights, when the wind howls through the trees, you can hear the whispering, and the footprints always return. Years passed, and the legend of Hinterwald remained a whispered warning among the villagers. Occasionally, travelers stumbled upon the forsaken land, drawn by morbid curiosity. Some returned with chilling tales of strange sounds and fleeting shadows. Others were never seen again. In 1925, a young priest named Father Wilhelm arrived in the village, intrigued by the whispers of the cursed farm. A man of unwavering faith, he dismissed the superstitions as nothing more than folklore. Armed with holy scriptures and his belief in divine protection, he ventured into Hinterwald, determined to bless the tainted land. He was found 2 days later at the edge of the forest, muttering incoherently, his eyes wide with unspeakable terror. His hands were raw, dirt caked beneath his fingernails as if he had tried to dig himself free from some unseen force. He spoke only one phrase before succumbing to fevered delirium. "It watches from beneath." The villagers dared not question him further. The farm remained untouched, its legacy a festering wound upon the land. Then, in 1931, a group of scholars arrived from Munich, dismissing the stories as mere peasant superstition. They set up camp on the outskirts of the farm, determined to uncover the truth behind the disappearances. They recorded their observations diligently, until their journals abruptly ended. Weeks later, a search party found their empty tents, their belongings undisturbed, their notes scattered in the snow. One passage stood out among the rest, scrawled hastily in the final entry. "We were wrong. It is not the house that is haunted. It is the ground itself. Something ancient, something hungry stirs beneath us. We should never have come here." The land was abandoned once more, left to fester beneath the weight of its secrets. To this day, Hinterwald remains a place of dread, its cursed soil untouched by time. And still, on stormy nights, the whispers return. And the footprints follow. That was chilling, wasn't it? Now let's dive into our next terrifying tale. The Curse of the Dybbuk Box. For centuries, the legends of the Dybbuk, an unquiet spirit from Jewish folklore, said to possess the living, were whispered only in hushed tones among the devout. It was a tale meant to warn, to keep people away from forces beyond their understanding. But some stories refused to remain buried. In the early 20th century, in a small village near Krakow, Poland, a woman named Rivka Cohen acquired an antique wine cabinet of unknown origin. A Holocaust survivor, she claimed the box had been used in a forbidden ritual by desperate souls seeking to contain something unspeakable. She warned her children never to open it, never to let it leave the family's possession. When Rivka passed in 1955, her belongings were divided, and the box found its way to an antique shop in Brooklyn, New York. Its new owner, David Weiss, a skeptical man with no patience for old superstitions, was the first to report strange occurrences. Not long after bringing the box into his home, he suffered violent nightmares, visions of shadowy figures whispering in a language he did not understand. His health deteriorated rapidly, plagued by fatigue, dizziness, and an unshakable sense of dread. At night, objects in his home moved of their own accord. Glasses shattered inexplicably, and the scent of jasmine and burning hair filled the air. Convinced the box was cursed, David sold it to an art dealer who displayed it in his gallery. The misfortunes only escalated. Customers who touched it fell ill. A fire erupted mysteriously one evening, destroying part of the store but leaving the box unscathed. The dealer, now deeply disturbed, hastily passed it along to another collector, who soon met with an untimely accident. Over the decades, the Dybbuk Box changed hands repeatedly, leaving behind a trail of tragedy. Those who possessed it experienced abrupt personality changes, crippling depression, uncharacteristic aggression, or a pervasive paranoia that drove some to madness. Electronic devices failed in its presence. Shadowy apparitions were glimpsed in reflections near it. And in every home it entered, the same two phrases were heard in whispers from unseen lips. "Let me out. I'm still here." By the early 2000s, the box had gained infamy. It became a subject of internet forums and paranormal investigations, each new owner attempting to uncover its secrets, only to be met with horror. Some sought to destroy it, but every attempt failed. Fires extinguished themselves, hammers splintered upon impact, and burying it only led to its inexplicable return. A well-known paranormal investigator, Matthew Larson, conducted a live-streamed experiment in 2008, opening the box despite numerous warnings. Within days, he reported intense nightmares and unexplained claw marks appearing on his body. His home was plagued by electrical failures, and his dog refused to enter the room where the box was kept. Eventually, he abandoned the project entirely, suffering from severe mental distress until his unexplained death 2 years later. Desperate to rid themselves of its influence, several owners attempted exorcisms. A group of occultists in Prague sealed the box within a circle of salt and iron, believing it would suppress the entity inside. Days later, their workshop burned to the ground, the only item intact amid the ashes being the Dybbuk Box itself. A team of rabbis in Jerusalem performed an ancient sealing ritual, encasing the box in a lead-lined container and burying it deep beneath an undisclosed location. But even now, whispers persist. Those who were once in possession of the box report nightmares, flickering lights, and the scent of jasmine and burning hair lingering in their homes. Legends about the Dybbuk Box refuse to fade. Despite being buried, rumors of its reappearance continue to surface. A collector in Romania claimed to have unearthed an object identical to the box in 2017, only for it to disappear under mysterious circumstances days later. Stories circulate of a cursed artifact turning up at estate sales, its previous owners never speaking of it, only warning, "Do not open it." The box's influence has even seeped into pop culture, inspiring horror films and television documentaries. However, those who delve too deeply into its story often find themselves suffering misfortune, as if simply acknowledging the box's existence invites its gaze upon them. And somewhere, beneath layers of earth or hidden within another unsuspecting home, the box waits. The Dybbuk, patient and relentless, is still here, watching, listening, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to claim it as their own. If you thought that was scary, wait until you hear this next story. The Haunting of Villisca. Villisca, Iowa, 1912. The quiet town of Villisca had never known true horror until the night of June 9, 1912. Under the cover of darkness, an unknown intruder crept into the Moore residence, carrying an axe that would soon become the tool of unspeakable carnage. By dawn, the entire Moore family, Josiah and Sarah, their 4 children, and 2 visiting house guests, lay butchered in their beds. The housekeeper, a devoted woman named Lena Stillinger, had no chance to scream before her skull was caved in by the blade. 8 people slain, and not a single neighbor had heard a sound. Whispers of the killer's identity circulated through the town, but no one was ever convicted. Suspicion fell on a wandering preacher, a jealous business rival, and even a deranged serial killer passing through. Yet as time stretched on, the town was left with only the ghosts of that night, lingering in the halls of the Moore home. The house sat in eerie silence for years after the murders. The townspeople, once familiar with its cheerful wooden facade, now avoided even looking at its darkened windows. The air inside remained heavy, thick with an invisible force that weighed upon anyone foolish enough to step through its doors. By the 1950s, new occupants had come and gone, each staying only a few months before fleeing in terror. Stories of unexplained weeping, footsteps echoing in the night, and objects moving of their own accord became common. Children who played too close to the house claimed they saw figures standing at the windows, staring with hollow eyes. Strangers still, some visitors reported losing time. They would enter a room and suddenly find themselves in another with no recollection of how they got there. Others heard their names whispered by unseen voices, coaxing them deeper into the house. One man, visiting out of morbid curiosity, emerged from the basement trembling, unable to explain why his arms were covered in deep scratches. In the 1990s, the house was converted into a tourist attraction, marketed as one of the most haunted locations in America. Paranormal investigators flocked to Villisca, eager to document the strange occurrences reported by visitors. And the house did not disappoint. Some guests described seeing the silhouettes of children moving through the upstairs hallway, only for them to vanish upon closer inspection. Others reported a persistent feeling of being watched, cold fingers brushing against their arms, and a chilling whisper just behind their ears. Audio recordings captured disembodied voices murmuring names in the dead of night. Flashlights flickered erratically, batteries drained in seconds, and once, a visitor swore she felt the weight of a body pressing down on her chest as though something, was lying in bed beside her. On one infamous occasion, a paranormal team stayed overnight, setting up cameras in every room. Their footage revealed something terrifying: a shadowy figure moving from room to room, pausing at each bed as if reliving the night of the murders. One fateful night in 2004, an amateur ghost hunter named Daniel Keene booked a private overnight stay at the Villisca house. He came equipped with cameras, voice recorders, and an insatiable curiosity. By midnight, he had captured eerie voices on tape, and his thermal camera had picked up inexplicable cold spots. At exactly 3:15 a.m., Daniel felt an overwhelming sense of dread flood through him. A shadow moved in the corner of the room. His breath caught. The air turned thick and stifling. Then the attic door creaked open by itself. With trembling hands, Daniel aimed his flashlight at the doorway. What he saw made his blood run cold. A figure loomed in the darkness, its eyes gleaming with something unnatural. The axe in its hand was rusted but still sharp. Before Daniel could scream, the shadow lunged. By morning, Daniel was found unconscious on the floor, his face twisted in terror. The cameras recorded nothing. The house had claimed another victim. To this day, the Villisca Axe Murder House remains one of the most feared places in the country. Paranormal shows document its hauntings, brave tourists attempt overnight stays, and yet, the spirits remain restless. Those who dare to enter never leave unchanged. Some wake with scratches along their arms. Others hear their names whispered in the night. And a few, just a few, leave with an unshakable feeling that something followed them home. In 2017, a young couple staying the night attempted a séance in the master bedroom. Midway through, the woman suddenly went rigid, her breath coming in short gasps. She later claimed she felt unseen hands close around her throat. When she looked in the mirror, faint bruises in the shape of fingers marred her skin. Visitors have since reported the sensation of being watched from the attic, where many believe the killer had hidden before striking. The rocking chair in the corner sometimes moves on its own, its slow creaking filling the silence of the night. Local historians now believe the spirits of the Moore family are trapped within the walls, eternally reliving their grisly fate. But others claim that something else lingers, something dark, something malevolent, something that still wields the axe. The town of Villisca still stands, its people carrying on with their lives. But when night falls and the wind howls through the streets, the house waits. The dead do not sleep. And neither does the one who took their lives. Brace yourself because the next story is even more disturbing. The house that never slept. Sarah Winchester sat in the dim glow of a single oil lamp, her trembling hands pressed against the heavy velvet of her morning gown. The air in the parlor felt dense, thick with the weight of something unseen. Across from her, a spiritualist with hollowed eyes and fingers like brittle twigs traced patterns in the air, murmuring incantations in a language Sarah did not recognize. The candle flame flickered violently. Then a whisper, soft as death itself, curled through the room. "They are here." Sarah's breath hitched. She had expected this. Had known it, deep within the marrow of her bones, since the day her husband and infant daughter had been taken from her. The spiritualist's gaze fixed on her, unblinking. "You must build, Mrs. Winchester. Build and do not stop. It is the only way to keep them at bay." From that night forward, Sarah did not rest. The hammers and saws sang a mournful dirge as the Winchester house grew like a living thing, twisting and sprawling without reason or plan. She followed no blueprint, only the whispered instructions that came in the dead of night. Staircases spiraled into ceilings. Doors opened to sheer drops. Hallways narrowed into suffocating corridors. And yet the spirits still came. At first it was small things. The tap of unseen fingers against a window pane, the distant weeping of a child in rooms long abandoned. But soon the hauntings grew bolder. Sarah would wake to the sound of phantom footsteps circling her bed, or catch a glimpse of shadowed figures in the reflection of her vanity mirror, men and women with gaping wounds, their eyes black pits of accusation. She tried to speak with them, begged them for forgiveness. But the dead do not grant absolution. They only hunger. One night, as Sarah wandered the labyrinthine halls, she heard the unmistakable sound of a gunshot. It echoed through the corridors, growing louder, closer. She turned a corner, and found herself in a room that had not been there before. The walls dripped with something dark, something warm. The air reeked of gunpowder and rot. In the center of the room stood a figure, a man, his chest a gaping ruin, the wound still fresh as though he had only just fallen. He raised a trembling hand and pointed at her. Sarah stumbled backward, slamming the door shut. When she turned, the hallway had changed. The door she had entered through was gone. The mansion had shifted again, folding in on itself like a writhing beast, trapping her in its ever-changing bowels. She ran blindly, past corridors she no longer recognized, past rooms that had no business existing. The house groaned and shuddered around her as if it too were alive. And in the distance, the spirits whispered, laughing as they followed. Sarah Winchester continued to build, never ceasing, never stopping. But no matter how many rooms she added, how many doors she locked, the dead always found a way in. The house would never be finished. And neither would her torment. The years passed and the mansion consumed her life. Servants whispered of strange happenings, tools disappearing, walls shifting overnight, footsteps echoing in vacant rooms. The workers, superstitious men hardened by labor, refused to stay after dark. They spoke of ghostly hands guiding their hammers, of hearing their names called from empty halls. Some left, unable to bear the weight of the unseen eyes that watched them work. Others stayed, bound by Sarah's inexhaustible wealth and their own fearful curiosity. Sarah herself rarely left the house. She became a specter in her own right, drifting through her endless halls, clad always in black, a candle flickering in her hand. At night, she held seances in the blue room, speaking in hushed tones with those she could no longer see but could always feel. The spirits never tired of reminding her why they lingered. They came in droves, soldiers, settlers, innocents slain by the rifles her family had built. Their pain was her inheritance and she bore it alone. One evening, the house betrayed her. She had been walking through the south wing, a section still under construction, when she realized she had taken a wrong turn. The corridors had changed again. Doors led to walls, staircases ended in nothingness. The very architecture seemed to mock her. And then she heard it, the ragged breathing of something behind her. Sarah turned slowly. The candlelight trembled. A shape loomed in the darkness, a towering figure draped in shadow, its face obscured save for two gleaming empty sockets where eyes should have been. It did not speak. It did not move. Yet Sarah felt its presence pressing against her, its hunger a tangible force in the air. She tried to step back, but the floor beneath her groaned, the boards warping like waves. The house was shifting again. The walls pressed in, the doorways vanished, trapping her in a narrowing corridor that squeezed the breath from her lungs. The candle flickered, then snuffed out. And in the darkness, the thing whispered, The servants found her hours later, collapsed in the hallway, her face a frozen mask of terror. She spoke not a word of what she had seen, but she did not need to. From that night on, the construction accelerated, the work frantic and ceaseless. The mansion expanded in every direction, its labyrinth growing ever more complex, more confounding, more inescapable. Yet no number of rooms could contain the horrors within. The spirits still walked. And Sarah, their warden, their prisoner, their penitent, continued to build. Until one night she simply stopped. The hammering ceased. The saws lay still. The great, writhing house held its breath. And Sarah Winchester, the woman who had outbuilt death itself, lay motionless in her bed, eyes open wide, staring at something only she could see. The mansion did not crumble. It did not fall into ruin. It remained silent and waiting. For the dead do not rest. And neither does the house that keeps them. Now for another dark and haunting tale that will send shivers down your spine. The Harbinger of Point Pleasant. The first time Evelyn Grayson saw the creature, she was driving home along Route 62, the winding road that ran alongside the Ohio River. The headlights of her old Ford Falcon cut through the mist, illuminating the skeletal trees on either side of the road. It was late, and the quiet hum of the radio did little to soothe her nerves. That was when she saw them, two glowing red eyes staring at her from the trees. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure was tall, impossibly so, with great black wings folded against its back. For a moment she could have sworn it wasn't just watching, it was studying her. Then, with an unnatural speed, it took flight, vanishing into the dark sky. Evelyn barely made it home that night, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, just a trick of the fog and the moonlight. But she wasn't the only one who had seen it. By the following week, the whispers had spread through the town of Point Pleasant like wildfire. More people came forward with their own sightings. An enormous winged figure perching on rooftops, lurking near the old TNT plant, or swooping low over cars on the deserted roads. Some claimed to hear an eerie humming sound, a frequency that burrowed deep into their skulls and left them shaken for days. Local newspapers ran headlines about the so-called Mothman, and the townsfolk debated what it could be. Some believed it was a cryptid, a flesh and blood creature unknown to science. Others whispered that it was something else entirely, an omen, a warning. And warnings, as it turned out, were something Point Pleasant desperately needed. On December 15, 1967, the Silver Bridge collapsed without warning during rush hour. The massive steel structure, once a proud landmark spanning the Ohio River, crumbled into the freezing waters below, taking 46 souls with it. Survivors described the moment as an ear-splitting groan of metal, followed by chaos and screams. Some claimed to have seen a dark shape circling above the bridge just before the disaster, its red eyes burning like embers in the gathering dusk. Evelyn was among those who stood at the riverbank, staring in horror as the wreckage bobbed on the surface. The air was thick with the scent of oil and twisted steel, and in that moment she knew, whatever the Mothman was, it had tried to warn them. The sighting stopped after that night. It was as if the creature had delivered its message and vanished into the shadows once more. But even years later, those who had seen it could not shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching, waiting. For the Mothman did not bring death. It only foretold it. And somewhere, in the dark corners of the world, it waited for the next tragedy to unfold. The town of Point Pleasant never truly recovered from the disaster. The Silver Bridge had been its lifeline, and with it gone, businesses struggled and families moved away. But those who remained kept the legend alive. They told their children about the Mothman, warning them to be wary of the woods at night, to heed the signs when they appeared. Evelyn, however, could not let it rest. The guilt gnawed at her. Had she spoken up, would it have made a difference? Had she been chosen for a reason? The dreams began soon after the collapse, dark and oppressive. She would find herself back on Route 62, headlights cutting through the fog, but this time, the eyes would appear in her rearview mirror, closer and closer until they consumed her. Determined to find answers, she began researching similar phenomena. What she found chilled her to the bone. Across the world, there were stories of winged beings appearing before disasters, shadowy figures seen before earthquakes, floods, and fires. Had the Mothman appeared elsewhere? And if so, where would it appear next? One evening, as she pored over her findings, her radio crackled to life. A voice, faint and mechanical, whispered a sequence of numbers followed by a single phrase, "It's not over." The static swallowed the message, but Evelyn's hands shook as she scribbled the numbers down. They matched coordinates. When she traced them on a map, her breath caught in her throat. The location pointed to a distant city far from Point Pleasant. She did not know what disaster was coming, but she knew one thing: the Mothman would be there. In the decades that followed, more sightings surfaced, scattered across the world like breadcrumbs leading to an unseen doom. The creature never lingered, only appearing in glimpses as if bound to the tragedies yet to unfold. In Chicago, in Chernobyl, in Japan before the Fukushima disaster. Always the same red eyes, the same towering shadow watching from the periphery. Evelyn never stopped looking. Her hair turned gray, her hands grew frail, but the nightmares never left her. Even on her deathbed, she clutched at the sheets, gasping warnings to the nurse beside her. "It's here," she whispered. "Don't you see? It's watching." The nurse dismissed it as the ramblings of an old woman. But as she left the room, the hallway lights flickered. A shadow passed by the window, and outside in the quiet streets of Point Pleasant, two red eyes gleamed from the darkness. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you more thrilling stories. And hit the bell icon to never miss an update.